Ranking Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman, thank you for your time. Let's start with Russia here because, again, our chief foreign affairs correspondent, Andrea Mitchell, telling us just a few moments ago that she's talked to two sources inside the Obama administration. They are characterizing this as, quote, a technical correction, perhaps not an easing of sanctions. Do you have any additional information regarding these corrections or easing of sanctions? What are we looking at here?
I would certainly hope that it's not more than a technical correction, because to ease any of the Russian sanctions right now would be a tragic mistake. We have the Russians embarked on a new military campaign in Ukraine. They're clearly testing what they can get away with this president. I think they understand that this president would be very reluctant to admit that his new Russia policy is already a failure. So they're pushing the limits already in Ukraine. I would like to see the president call for greater sanctions, a stronger pushback on Russia against what they're doing in Ukraine. Obviously don't have much confidence that's going to happen. But I think also with respect to any of the sanctions that were imposed by President Obama for Russians meddling in our election campaign, it would send exactly the wrong message if this is anything but a technical correction.
We also, a few moments ago from the White House press secretary, we got what appears to be a timeline of sorts with regards to the military operation in Yemen, in which we lost an American service member. Also, a number of civilians were killed, including an 8-year-old girl. As we learn more about what happened in Yemen, what can you make of that? Are we getting the whole story on that operation?
Well, these operations don't take place overnight, in the sense that they require weeks and weeks of planning. And so I wouldn't be surprised at all if this was an operation that was well under contemplation going back into the last presidency. Often they're waiting for the right opportunity. And, you know, things can go wrong, and things do go wrong. Often some of the targets are tipped off one way or another, sometimes by sheer ill luck on our part. So these are risky operations, and, you know, I do think that it calls for a very careful, deliberate process where you evaluate what's the intelligence value you hope to gain if it's an intelligence gathering operation. And here it looks like part of the goal was to capture information, and what are the risks to our troops. But I wouldn't leap to the conclusion that it was poorly thought out or there were mistakes in execution. Sometimes in the maelstrom of these kind of operations, things just go wrong. But it does certainly call on us to understand the risks inherent in these kind of operations. We
continue to learn more about that phone call over the weekend between the president and his counterpart in Australia. Is our relationship with that country, is it damaged now, or are we making much ado about nothing?
It is damaged. I met this week with some Australian parliamentarians. It was before this blow up on the phone. This is one of our most prized relationships. From an intelligence point of view, we have fewer, closer partners than we do Australia. Australia's fought side by side with us in war after war. They are one of our most valued partners. And that the president would get off on such a bad foot with our ally in this kind of a confrontation over the phone, over an agreement that was reached that we need to honor and that we should honor, I think it does damage. It does damage to that particular relationship, but it also does damage in terms of what the Australian people think of America and think of what we're going to do, what our policy is going to be, whether they can trust us, whether they can count on us to push back against China, to them as cooperatively in the fight against ISIS. It throws a lot into question with one of our dearest partners. And I tell you this, it's deeply disturbing to me that this president seems to have harsh words for our Australian allies, for our German ally, for our Mexican friends. The only one he doesn't have harsh words for is Russia, apparently. And Russia is the one he ought to direct his harsh words against.
This was President Trump just a few hours ago at the National Prayer Breakfast. Take a listen, Congressman.
When you hear about the tough phone calls I'm having, don't worry about it. Just don't worry about it. They're tough. We have to be tough. It's time we're going to be a little tough, folks. We're taken advantage of by every nation in the world virtually. It's not going to happen anymore. It's not going to happen anymore.
So roughly this time yesterday, we got news about Iran. Trump today reiterating what his national security advisor said Wednesday, quote, Iran has been formally put on notice for firing a ballistic missile. Should have been thankful for the terrible deal the U.S. made with them. What does put on notice mean? You're a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Do you have some sort of clear definition?
First of all, in terms of those comments at the prayer breakfast, I was at the prayer breakfast, and I tell you, it was very hard for many of us in the audience to hear him talk about religious freedom right after the imposition of this Muslim ban. But also, you know, his tough talk for our allies like Australia, the whole idea that we ought to be confronting our friends and allies. We are tremendously benefited from those alliances. His view of the world apparently is that everybody's cheating us. Everybody's out to get us. We're the poor victim. No, we are a great beneficiary, frankly, of these tremendous alliances we have with countries like Australia, our NATO alliance. Those are to our benefit, and he needs to start understanding that. In terms of Iran is a menace. Iran is a grave threat, and we ought to be working with those same allies to confront Iran when it violates UN resolutions over ballistic missiles. I don't know what put on notice means, and there may be some value to making the Iranians wonder what it means, but I think the State Department, our own State Department, wonders what that means. The American people certainly wonder what that means, and I would have more confidence in this administration if I knew that this was the product of thought and interagency consultation, that we had talked to our allies about it beforehand and told our allies we're going to put them on notice. We'd like you to do the same thing. None of that appears to have happened here. I think this caught Americans by surprise as much as it did our allies.
You think perhaps it was a precursor to some sort of justification for withdrawing from the nuclear deal?
This is what concerns me, that they are looking for a reason to repudiate the agreement. If we do that, Iran will go back to enriching. There'll be no reason for them not to. And it won't isolate Iran. It will isolate the United States. So they will have a runaway nuclear program. We will be more isolated. That is not a foreign policy success. That would be a foreign policy disaster. So, yes, we ought to confront them on their ballistic missile program. We ought to confront them on their support of Hezbollah and their terrorist proxies. We ought to confront them on the belligerence of the Houthis and the firing on our ships and our allies, their provocative actions in the Strait of Hormuz. There ought to be consequences for all of this. We ought to work with our allies to impose those consequences. But we shouldn't use this to tear up a nuclear agreement that's in our interest because it has curtailed Iran's nuclear program.
Well, we have covered Russia, Yemen, Australia, and Iran. It's a good thing you're on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman.
Actually, it's the House Intelligence Committee.
Excuse me, the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman Adam Schiff, Congressman.